All right, let's dive in. What if one of the most debated books in the Bible wasn't just prophecy, but a code? Today, we're going to try and crack open the book of Revelation to unpack a really complex theory, all about a single cryptic warning sent to an ancient church. Okay, so this quote right here, this is our starting point. It's this pretty wild idea that Revelation isn't just something you read, it's a code you have to break. Now look, there are tons of ways to interpret this book, but today we're exploring one specific and, yeah, pretty controversial theory. It argues the key to it all, the cipher, is actually hidden in plain sight, scattered all throughout the rest of the Bible. So, where do you even start with decoding something like that? Well, imagine getting a performance review, from the big boss. According to the source material for this explainer, that's exactly what chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation are. They're these 7 letters sent to 7 very real churches back in ancient Turkey, and each one is basically a spiritual report card. And this is where the code breaking really kicks into gear. The source we're looking at points out this consistent 7-part pattern in every single letter. Think of it like a template, right? You've got a specific title for Jesus, some praise for what they're doing right, a major concern, instructions on how to fix it, and then a promise for those who get it right. This repeating structure, it's not an accident. It's our toolkit for figuring out the message. All right, so let's put that toolkit to the test on one letter in particular, the one sent to the church at Thyatira. I mean, the priest section is just a glowing review. They're getting kudos for their works, their faith, their patience. They're even getting better over time. But then comes the but, that notwithstanding. And Jesus has one major problem with them. And it all boils down to this one super cryptic phrase, that woman Jezebel. Okay, this right here, this is our central clue. If Jezebel is part of the code, then to crack it, we have to figure out who the original Jezebel even was. This name wasn't just picked out of a hat. It was a seriously loaded reference, a historical callback that anyone reading this letter way back then would have understood instantly. So let's pull up her file from the Old Testament, shall we? In short, Queen Jezebel was the foreign wife of an Israelite king, and she was notorious for 3 main things. First, she systematically tried to replace the worship of God with pagan idols. Second, she literally hunted down and killed the true prophets. And third, she had zero problem using deception and murder to grab property and power, like that infamous story where she had an innocent man, Naboth, killed just so the king could take his vineyard. Right, so we've got this profile of an ancient, really corrupt queen. But what on earth does she have to do with a Christian church hundreds and hundreds of years later? Well, this is where the source material for this explainer makes a huge leap. It argues this isn't just a history lesson. This name, Jezebel, is actually the key that unlocks a prophecy about the next 1,000 years of church history. And here it is. This is the core of the whole theory. The source claims that Jezebel wasn't a real woman in that church at all. The name was a code word. It was a prophetic symbol for a future system, a system that would perfectly mirror what the original Jezebel did. And according to this interpretation, that system was the medieval church. This timeline shows you exactly how the source maps out this so-called Jezebel era. It argues the seeds were planted way back in 445 AD, when the Bishop of Rome first claimed authority over all the other churches. Then it points to this notoriously corrupt period in the 10th century and says it hit its peak around 1208 AD under Pope Innocent III, who actually sanctioned the violent extermination of dissenters. So this whole period, we're talking over 1,000 years, is what the source identifies as the fulfillment of that Jezebel prophecy, and it only really ends with the Reformation. And this slide, well, it lays the parallels right out, side by side. The argument is that history rhymed, Jezebel's persecution of the prophets, in this view, that's mirrored by the Inquisition's persecution of so-called heretics. Her seizing Naboth's vineyard, that's echoed in the widespread confiscation of property from those same dissenters. And her introduction of pagan worship is paralleled by claims that the medieval church absorbed and sort of Christianized a bunch of pagan rituals and traditions. The source argues the pattern is just undeniable. And just to give you a sense of the kind of power structure we're talking about at the height of this era, the source points to this commentary on Pope Innocent III. Now, this wasn't just a claim of spiritual leadership. No. This was a claim to be the vicar of Christ, his substitute, with authority over everything, on earth, in heaven, and in hell. I mean, that is an assertion of absolute, total power. So, what happens when someone claims that kind of absolute power? Well, our source argues you get this. One of the signature moves of Pope Innocent III's time in power was to formalize the Inquisition, and this was essentially a secret office with the power to torture anyone who was even suspected of disagreeing, and then just seize all their property. It's a pretty stark contrast between the title Vicar of Christ and the methods being used to enforce that authority. And the human cost of this system, at least as our source estimates it, is just staggering. It claims that in one 30-year period alone, 900,000 Protestants were put to death during a papal war that was aimed at their extermination. Just let that number sink in for a second. So why dig all of this up? I mean, this is some dark history. The source we're referencing argues this isn't about pointing fingers at the past. The whole point of decoding this letter is to understand its warning for any generation, including our own. That the story of Jezebel is this timeless cautionary tale about what happens when any religious system gets unchecked power and starts to compromise its core beliefs. But here's something I find really fascinating. The letter itself actually predicts there would be people who just wouldn't go along with it all. Right in the middle of this huge warning, there's a message to those who have not this doctrine. And the instruction to them is simple. Hold fast. Just keep doing what you're doing. It's like a built-in acknowledgement that even during this huge period of compromise, a faithful remnant would always be there. Okay, so when you boil it all down, what's the decoded message from this ancient letter, according to our source? It's really a three-part warning that still resonates today. First, guard against spiritual compromise. Second, be really cautious about mixing outside traditions with your core faith. And third, and this is maybe the most important one, condemn any use of institutional power to silence or persecute people who just happen to disagree. So in the end, this interpretation transforms a 2,000-year-old letter into this powerful and, pretty controversial mirror held up to history. And it leaves all of us with a really challenging question, no matter what our beliefs are. Where do you draw the line between a sacred, cherished tradition and a dangerous spiritual compromise? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining me.